This is a new area of research for CGD, and we are getting underway now on a new research stream that will focus on the next generation of humanitarian system reform. That's going to look at three particular areas: how to change power dynamics at the field level, particularly to bring in the voices of affected populations to actual humanitarian decision-making in a way that we've long aspired to as a system but never really achieved. Second, looking at the financing incentives that are built into the humanitarian system and how that shapes behavior. The paper that we're launching today that Masood referenced looks specifically at that issue, and I'll talk about that in more detail in just a moment. And then the third area we're going to look at is the fragmented governance structures in the system, and thinking about some new models for how the system could be governed to enable more coherence, because a lot of the fragmentation that we see in humanitarian delivery on the ground reflects the fragmentation that's baked in right at the very top of the system.
We do have a lot of serious issues that we have to deal with, that if just because these organizations have kind of grown up out of one reason or another. WFP was a surplus disposal agency. UNICEF was the agency that did something to help children after World War II. I mean, all of a sudden, now we're faced with the current big operations that we know of, but there really hasn't been real review about what we're really doing and how we're really doing it. And now we're seeing things fall kind of into our collective laps globally without a good answer what to do. Jeremy mentioned cash. If in fact the future is cash, and I know there's issues, political issues here, but if the global future is cash, then why do we need a big logistics organization? Why don't we just hire MasterCard?
How do we make this system better when it began with a bunch of agencies and operations, trying to do good, but in a very uncoordinated, unmanaged way, right? And that's the challenge. So this is, this is an ongoing process, and which doesn't mean there aren't opportunities for real departures, real progress, and real changes. You have agency interests, that Trump, no pun intended, sectoral and broader requirements. You have governments that have their own predilections. I ran a bureau that had a love affair with UNHCR. I think it was a good love affair. It was a good love affair, but sometimes you need a little tough love, and in a situation where 3/4 of international humanitarian response is funded by governments, of the 30 billion or so, 28 billion or so annually, 3/4 of that comes from governments. It's kind of hard. You got to get governments on board.
I think we have two overarching imperatives, and they're not always working in lockstep, and in fact, maybe they're working sometimes at cross purposes, but I think we probably need to continue to sort of in fits and starts do both of them at once. And the first is the question of how do we achieve more fundamental transformation of the system that we currently have, which has really so far, I think, been the focus of the conversation we've had up here, and is largely the focus of the paper. And the second is, can we or should we envision a radically new system? And if so, are we willing to face some of the existential questions that would pose? The paper starts to touch on this, in particular when you get into the cash discussion, and Catherine, you touched on this too, I think, about this question of if cash is the future, do we need a world in which you have massively expensive UN agencies sitting in massively expensive UN cities, right? I mean, I think those are the kinds of existential questions that we sometimes dance around, and I think it's probably always worth continuing to put on the table.